Jake, are we live? Are we live yet?
Right.
Yeah, we went live at 5:31, like I said.
Get on with it.
So am I starting now then?
Yep.
Okay. Well, so thank you everyone for joining us, and those of you who are here for the first time, yeah, thanks a lot for coming along. And those of you who listened to the talk last year I did with Dave Morphy, thanks for coming back. So this is like a part of a series I'm doing where I talk to industry experts on varying subjects. And today I'm really excited to share some high speed knowledge, care of Jason Bergen, whose company Love High Speed is probably the leading company in the whole of Europe on high speed, everything speed. Yeah, I'm really excited about this. We're going to be getting into all things high speed. Basically, we're going to be talking about the cameras, specialist lenses, the lighting, which is a big part of it, as you'll discuss, and also the workflow, which is another thing that's actually something that people don't always kind of acknowledge. I think these days there's a kind of like sort of, well, the perception of slow motion through the years has changed somewhat. Nowadays, people can do slow motion, on their phones relatively easily. You have the iPhone and the Samsung speed shots, and I think because of that, people have a kind of a false sense of accessibility to high speed, and they don't realise that when you high end, then you are actually kind of sort of bending physics, and there's lots of things to be considered. So
Ian,
that's
just a quick note. If you go into your Discord settings and change the audio pickup levels, you keep cutting in and out. So I think if you just turn auto pickup off and then turn the noise floor all the way down, and then that way people just hear everything you say, mate.
Okay, so let me just go. So I'm going into settings and I'm going into
Voice
and video.
And then where it says input sensitivity, automatically determine input sensitivity.
Yes.
So if you untick that and then drag the dial all the way down to like minus 90 dB.
Minus 90 or minus 100?
Either or.
Yeah, okay, I've done that now.
Cool,
Is
perfect.
that better?
Yep.
Do you want me to start again, or shall I?
No, it's fine. It was only just like it was like every other few words, like you just dip out for a second, but yeah,
okay,
it's all good.
Okay. So hang on, how do I get back on full screen? Just do that quickly. So you would have seen Jason's work. I guarantee you, he's done a huge. His CV is really impressive. He's done a huge amount of commercials and some really high-end feature films. Wonder Woman, Macbeth, Kingsman, Star Wars, Solo, Sherlock, just to mention a few. So anyway, I'm really pleased to have here with me Jason from Love High Speed. Hey, Jason.
Hi, Ian.
Thanks for coming along.
This is great.
So yeah, we're going to start showing some. Firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to show a couple of commercials, high-speed commercials, because I think they represent the kind of variety of high speed and the kind of finesse of it really well. So Jake, if you're there, could you queue up the Swatch and the Baileys, and we'll watch both of those first.
8 to 1,000 frames a second. It's quite a while ago that job, but it just stayed in my mind a lot. And obviously the rigs we used, some of my favourite rigs, motion control rigs, and so it's one of my favourite ones.
So let's talk a little bit about the rigs then. So was that a Phantom Onyx? Sorry, a Phantom 4K.
That camera was a Phantom Flex 2K. It was about
2K, right?
6 or 7 years ago, that job.
Yeah.
So 2.5K camera shoots up to 1600 frames a second, and we use something called a Vortex rig, which is a circular tracking rig, wireless dolly basically. There is a behind the scenes video that we've got of it. It's a friction dolly. Camera has to be wireless. It uses regular track. And it takes a couple of rotations to get to speed, and then you get a couple of rotations to shoot with, and then you cut the camera. So everything has to be wireless. It's quite an
and that was used on the Bailey's job, but that was also used on Swatch as well.
No, sorry, Schwartz was using bolts.
Right. Okay.
Bolt high speed camera. There was one in shot, and there's one that we had on the camera as well.
And so, and how many with Swatch? How many cameras were you using?
That was a 4-camera 1-day shoot.
So
we had
four
a second unit that was picking up loads of the close-ups, and then everything else we did was a one-shot deal. There were no resets. Everything was captured live.
Right.
It
and
would
so you
reset that.
At a certain point you had 4 cameras shooting one event, basically.
3 on 1. The second unit was constantly rolling, doing its own thing, in the same studio that we were in a corner, and then we had 3 cameras on some of the bigger shots.
And they were all Phantom Flex 2K cameras.
They were Phantom Flex 2K cameras, and they were Phantom Miros.
Okay. And could you talk a little bit about the lighting? Because when we were doing the preparation for this, you mentioned to me one of the things we'll get into talking about is the lighting requirements for high speed. And one of the kind of aspects that most DOPs should know about is that when you get into high speed filming over a certain frame rate, you're very liable to get kind of like a flicker effect, which comes from the hertz of the electricity you're using and how the bulb or how the light reacts to that. So so Jason, you're saying to me with the Swatch, you had a 2K bulbs in a big softbox, right? Was that?
Yeah. So the main lighting rig for the Schwartz explosions, the powder explosions, was an array of 40 blondes, 2K lights, which normally you wouldn't use with high speed, but because a softbox from above was chosen to be lit by the DP, he wanted to point all his lights straight down. Normally, you use tungsten 5K or bigger to limit the flicker or have no flicker. Anything,
and that's because the bulb on a 5K or bigger, it won't refresh as quickly. Is that how it works? Or?
Yeah, so you got a turnaround speed of between 100 and 120 frames a second. Anything below 100, 120 frames a second, you can use any film lights, tungsten lights, and they work fine and they don't flicker. The minute you get to about 100, 120 frames a second, you need to use 5K bulbs or bigger, because anything smaller will flicker. And that's really because the camera is turning off and on more than 100 times a second, but the bulb, which is plugged into the mains in the UK, turns on and off 50 times a second. And with the smaller bulbs, like a 3 or a 1K, they cool down in that 50th of a second when they turn off and then back on again. Whereas bigger bulbs, 5Ks, tend to not do that so much, and their heat is retained in the light and the bulb.
Yeah. So basically, he was defying that rule because he understood that by putting them all through a softbox, and then you were saying you use the 3 phases of the electricity.
Yeah, so I mean, because this was a while ago, before the current revolution of lighting. Big tungsten was really the only, you know, big tungsten and HMI 1000 hertz was only the only real go-to lights for doing this kind of work. And the biggest problem with this is that when you've got a softbox from above, you want the lights to point straight down. Most tungsten and most HMIs don't allow you to shoot straight down anyway. Whereas the bigger ones, I mean, the 5Ks, the 10Ks, the 12Ks, the blondes, they can do. So in this particular case, which is a bit risky, the DP decided to pre-light the shoot, obviously, as you would do in this particular case. And he put 42Ks into a quite tightly packed softbox. And every other bulb, every other light was wired across 3 phases. So you make sure you've got a 3-phase studio, and you make sure that none of the same phase don't touch each other. And you've got to have a really tight, compact area where you fill with lights. If you spread it out and have 80 over a much bigger area, you'll see flicker. But if it's nice and tight, equally spaced over 3 phases, it's sort of it's a trick, basically. It always makes me a bit nervous because if you're not there in the pre-light, but it always works.
Yeah, that's really clever, and that's quite ballsy. And I like that, the fact that he took that risk, because I do think the lighting in that really worked for the subject matter by having that top soft light.
Back then,
it
you
really
needed to
added
take
to it.
that risk because the lights were not available. There weren't sky panels that you can point down. There wasn't LEDs that you can point straight down. I mean, to a certain extent, people still do that now because tungsten is, a good bang for the buck. All the new lights cost more. A blonde probably costs £10 a day to rent.
Yeah, and also the quality of the light as well. I mean, the fact that the spices look so vibrant, I think was probably in part down to the fact he used tungsten light.
There's a question here from Aaron von der Mellen, who's basically saying, is it true that 5K or bigger don't flicker as much because they don't cool down? Basically, yes. The bigger the bulb in tungsten, the more stable you are, although there's always a little bit of flicker.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on now to the Bailey's campaign that we watched earlier. Firstly, what speeds were you shooting that at?
That was, I think I answered this before, thinking you were asking for the Schwartz, for the Baileys. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that was about 700 to 1,000 frames a second.
So going back to the Schwartz, then what was that shot at?
That went all the way with the explosions, the wide shot explosions. That was 1,600 frames a second.
All right, okay, cool. Yeah, just so we're clear about that.
I think there was loads of speeds used in Schwartz, but the wide shots were definitely shot at 1,600.
So the wide shots were the slowest, were the fastest filming in the slowest motion?
Not necessarily. I just remember the wide shot.
Right, okay.
I'm pretty certain the whole camera frame rate was used. It's often the case that people will shoot at maximum speed and change the speed later on.
Yeah. Is that something you would advise people to do that, or do you think that might be a
waste of... It really depends on what you're doing. It's always wise to shoot a little bit more than what you need if there's a sort of, you're not entirely sure how long you want it to last, but doubling and tripling the frame rate might be slightly daft because you're losing depth of field because you need to put it on the frame rate or you take it off the shutter. So yeah, sometimes that's handy, but it doesn't always have to be the way.
Yeah. Is there, on the subject of depth of field, is there a depth of field that you kind of would recommend? With high speed, we were talking about this before, where you were saying that for the eye to really read what's going on, sometimes it's wiser to have a deeper focus.
I think the more common way of shooting normal speed is generally for lower depth of field. At least it has been for the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have that as a mindset of something that they want to do on a lot of shoots, if not all shoots. When it comes to high speed, when the action is so small, is so fast, actually having a bigger depth of field, definitely for tabletop, is much clever idea because the shot will last for longer. If you do a macro food shot or a drinks pouring shot, you really don't want to be at 1-3. In actual fact, you really want to have a bigger shot. It really depends on what you're doing, but for the most part, when you're close up, depth of field is pretty low anyway. So even if you have 8 or 11 at 18 inches, it's going to look like low depth of field, but 1-3 will mean that the shot, if you're doing a pour in the center of the glass, every time the drop comes back up after the pour, it's going to be in the wrong place and it'll be out of focus. So you tend to want more depth of field with macro and the smaller stuff. And
So
as a
yeah,
general rule, high speed, maybe you want more.
yeah. So along with the higher speed frame rate requiring more lights, you also require more light to get a deeper depth of field. So you do naturally get into far bigger lights, and then that produces. If you were shooting with tungsten lights, that will produce maybe heat issues as well. So if you're doing food shots, for example, then it is a very specialist world you're getting into, then, isn't it?
I have a feeling the science says that if you had 8 10K tungsten lights and 82K tungsten lights, the heat's probably going to be the same. But so I would say that big tungsten and loads of little tungsten, it's sort of still hot if you've got the same amount of kilowatts. But when it comes to food, yeah, you probably want to use other lights that don't give off heat. And obviously
Yeah.
there are varying ranges: HMIs, LEDs, long strikes, keener flows.
So we're going to get into some of those later with some of the other examples. So now breaking down Baileys a little bit, you were basically there, from what I can see, there's a fair bit of composite work where it's elements that you filmed high speed, and then later on in post-production, those elements were composited together to create the effect. What were the high speed elements? Do you remember?
Well, there's a girl on wires that we use, the Vortex rig, which I mentioned before. And that's,
And
quite an amazing, it's good to work with because you wire work, textiles, fans, circular tracking dollies.
in fact, if you pause there a second, Jason, we'll have a look at that clip. Jake, could you line that clip up? So see if we can find the BTS. Didn't we have that queued up before?
Yeah, 2 seconds. Should have it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll carry on talking. So Jake's going to find that shot. Oh, we got it here.
Frames a second, you could be capturing 20 to 40 times slower than that.
I mean, the BTS shots always look really impressive when you see bolt arms flying around and really fast tracking shots. But in reality, when you're shooting at 700 frames a second, you won't actually see that much of the move in shot unless you ramp the footage. Is that right?
If you use the really fast cameras like the Onyx, yes, but I'm pretty certain at 1,000 frames a second you'll see it all. But you need to have a background, and you really need to have the right reason for using that. There are lots of people who levitate towards these particular devices, but the reality is you really need to have a set, and you really need to have the right idea to use it well, because it's not a track and dolly if you end up needing to go slow. and the bolt is really for fast moves. You can do slow moves, but ultimately, if you end up going slow with the item, it's the wrong piece of kit.
And when you're getting booked out with your high-speed cameras, how often do they require kind of like movement with it as well? Is that kind of becoming more popular now to go for a kind of high-speed bolt motion control or high-speed tracking?
It's very common. Bolt is very common now. I mean, maybe a third of shoots have some motion control on that we do.
Yeah,
Everybody wants to move the camera quickly.
yeah,
It is time consuming, and it often looks easy, and it can be easy, but the the more complicated shot you get, the more logarithmically it takes up your day to get right.
yeah. So kind of like a bit of advice to young producers out there and young, directors, DOPs. We spoke a little bit about what ends up being seen on screen and how you get value on screen. So if you said that there's a kind of like priorities that you would advise a producer, say a young producer phoned you up and they only had a certain amount of budget, how would you prioritize what equipment you would suggest or what process you would suggest?
It really depends. We're not always in the door at that stage. It depends on who it is. It's not a very easy question to answer that, because you really have to have someone who trusts you, but I also need to understand their vision. And often when these calls come in, they ask you generically about what you're doing, but you're not necessarily given the treatment. Other jobs, you get let in the door really early on, and if you know the people involved, the DPs, you'll be involved at that, and to a certain extent, you help to help in the pre-production of what they're going to do for that particular shot. It really depends. Every job works differently, and every client wants something else from you. So if they ask us, we'll tell them for sure. But our opinion is only one of the multiples opinions that matter on the shoot.
Do you, I mean, what I find happens these days, unfortunately, particularly on commercials, is that we don't really have pre-production meetings between the sort of heads of department. And what I remember the few times when I have actually met, for example, the art department ahead of the shoot, that's quite a privilege. And that meeting that I have with them saves production a tremendous amount of money, I find, because a lot of decisions can get made there and then. And it's just a way better workflow and a way clearer kind of line of communication. Would you sort of, if there are young producers sort of listening now that weren't that familiar with high-speed filming, would you say it's advisable to get you in quite early on to talk them through exactly?
I mean, I'm keen to do it. We do. I suppose there is a massive amount of jobs that we do where we get contacted before, months before the job to ask our advice. Although often the things evolve more when we come back and do it again, when we actually do the job. But it really depends. There are like I'm always keen to talk to anyone with an idea, even if it ends up going in nowhere, the job fizzles out, or they don't go down the high speed route. But I mean, it's very good to be in at an early stage in most regard. I like that. Not everyone does it. Some people need it, some people don't.
And what would you say the main mistakes that producers make when they're sort of planning high-speed shoots without much experience? What would you say the biggest mistake they make in your view?
Go back on that again. Say that again.
What would you say the biggest mistake young producers would make in when they putting together a high-speed shoot? What would your advice be to them?
Probably not phoning us straight away. I don't know. There isn't one particular thing. I can't answer that one. I'm really sorry.
All right. Well, should we get on to the sort of workflow sides of things before we move
Sure.
on to the next clip? One of the things, for example, we were talking the other day about the camera. I mean, should we just briefly introduce the cameras that you supply, the sort of modern day cameras and what they do? That might be a good start, and then we'll look at another clip.
Sure. So we've got high-end cameras and we've got lower-end cameras. And essentially, the higher end cameras are cameras that will always come with a technician from us. The two cameras that I'm putting in this classification is a Phantom Flex 4K and a Phantom Onyx. These cameras have very fast workflows. They save shots very quickly. Maximum downtime is 1 minute in between takes, and the camera technician will manage the running and the stopping of the take, the cutting of the take, and saving the shot as efficiently as possible to get shooting as quickly as again possible. So you're not holding anyone up.
See, that's something that, going back to my previous question, that will be something that the producers should really be aware of. It's the time it takes to save a clip, right? That's a massive difference in workflow.
If you want to go back to the previous question, the previous question was a bit tricky because it's a little bit open-ended, but ultimately, it's not going for the cheapest piece of kit. So, for example, a Flex 4K, which I just mentioned before, which is our most commonly used camera, it has 128 gigs of RAM and it does 10 seconds at 1,000 frames a second at 4K, and it will save that shot in 1 minute. We have a smaller version of that camera. It's called a VO 4K. It has about half the RAM, so it will do 5 seconds at 1,000 frames a second. It's about a third of the Flex 4K with a technician to rent in a day, but it will take up to 13 minutes to save a shot, as opposed to 30 seconds for the same amount of RAM on a Flex 4K. At the end of the day, it's potentially cheaper to shoot on a Flex 4K than it is on a VO if you're going to wait around for 12 minutes or more per take. But on the way in, it looks like it's cheaper to use the other camera. The image is the same. The features are almost the same. But the downtime is huge on a VO. You can also do 3-minute saves on a VO, but you have to be connected to a cable. That again is 6 times slower than a Flex 4K. And you really need a technician to do the 3-minute saves anyway. So you're not really saving much. So, I mean, often people levitate towards the cheapest piece of kit, and it really depends on what the day has in store for the high-speed shooting. If it's one shot here, one shot there, sure, maybe the VO is the right camera. But if it's shooting all day long, it isn't. And the Flex 4K will probably save them money at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. Very, very good. So look, just to summarize, before we see our next clip, we spoke briefly about the lighting requirements and tungsten lights, and how we'll get a bit more into this later on, how with high-speed filming, you have to become very aware of what lighting you're using and what effect that might have on a high-speed filming, flicker being a major problem, or the perception of flicker. We'll get into the perception of flicker later on. And then we spoke about, sort of like also being aware of when you're shooting macro work or close-up high speed, you might need a deeper depth of field. And again, that has an impact on what lighting you use and how much of it you use. And now we're just speaking about the workflow and how people might not realize that by hiring a cheaper camera and not having a proper technician there could cost you a lot of time. And that's if things are going well. And if you don't have a high-speed technician and something goes wrong, and then again, there's going to be potentially disastrous impacts on your shooting day. So, high speed is a specialist thing, even though, like I said in the introduction, that the perception of high speed's changed over the years, and now because it is seemingly more accessible, people don't really sometimes understand all of the factors that you have to take into account when kind of embarking on this. Anyway, let's look at our next clip. So the next one is the Gap commercial, right? I just love the elegance of that and the fact it's deceptively kind of simple looking. Do you want to talk us through kind of how that was done? Could you break down a little bit about how that was achieved?
The reason why I wanted to show that one was really to show a job that used slightly different lights. Our involvement is relatively small, a bit of the trampoline work, and obviously Alexa XTs were used for a chunk of it, and our stuff was more of a trampoline moment. Really nicely orientated, that job, really nicely posted, and incredibly well lit. That was mainly using 100K soft suns, which is a Luminese light, and they're the biggest light source you can get, and they're stable at 1,000 frames a second.
And was that? Do you remember? Was that a soft sun in its? Presumably that's shot in a studio, and the soft sun was far away on some kind of sort of high stand, or do you remember how it set up? Was it
pretty much always on some kind of high lift or crane?
Yeah.
This is a studio shoot with quite a large set,
Yeah.
and the DP wanted to use one large light that obviously simulated the sun.
Yeah. So was that was just a bare soft sun in the corner of the sort of stage sort of thing?
So that's a soft sun in the back of the stage. Yeah, probably, I don't know, 100 feet distance from the set.
Yeah,
it's not that far away, but it's obviously and that's also a large depth of field. So this was shot not in a sort of contemporary way, so to speak. It was shot more with a large depth of field.
Yes,
and that was just a choice that the DP and the director made.
Yeah, well, it has that kind of Escher quality to it, doesn't it? A very graphic quality that I think is achieved through that kind of deeper depth of field. That's a nice piece of work. And so you're saying that the soft sun's pretty much stable up to what frames a second do you say?
So we actually developed a box for the soft sun with Cirrolite, so that the soft suns were stable. So that's a soft sun used with a box called a speed box, which essentially irons out any flicker. So you can get about 1,000 frames a second out of a soft sun. That was the 100K. There is a new one, but I haven't tested it yet. But yeah, so about 1,000 frames a second with the speed box. It's stable.
And your portion of that shoot was the trampoline work. And do you remember what frame rates you were shooting at?
I'm pretty certain it was 1,000.
1,000.
Yeah.
And that was the Phantom Flex 4K or the 2K?
Yes, 4K.
The 4K camera, right? And is the 4K
this particular job? This was the sort of job where you'd shoot at faster speeds, because we were literally doing 2 or 3 people on a trampoline, but doing one jump and back, and cut. So we had the time in the RAM buffer of the camera to shoot for longer. So they decided and obviously, as you can tell, they've speed ramped it back a fair bit, but they've got the flexibility in the frame rate that they captured to do what they want.
Yeah. So they could decide the kind of speed of the motion later on in the post to see how it was flowing, because they'd captured enough frames to do that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, and just speaking a little bit more about the camera, it's quite high contrast. Quite kind of high key image. Just moving on to kind of the tonal range of the cameras. The 2K Flex and the 4K. Was there a difference in sensitivity and in dynamic range?
Normal speed digital cameras have always inherently had more dynamic range than a high speed camera. It's not easy to get frame rate up, and when they design the sensor, they put priorities. And with Aries, it's color, Alexa's it's color and latitude, and with Phantom, speed's always at the front end. It's always the most important thing. So prior to the Flex 4Ks, none of the high-speed cameras had any more than 9.5, 10 stops. And the Flex 4K came out, it was an incredibly greater dynamic range at 12.5 stops.
And the Onyx, how many
as well.
How many stops dynamic range is the Onyx, which is the highest speed?
The Onyx is about 10.5, 11, I would say.
Right.
That's a major breakthrough camera as well. I mean, that camera's 12,500 frames a second at HD. The camera that was out that before that wasn't HD, or it depends on which way you look at it, but it smashed the speed record by 4 times. So the fastest HD camera before that was 2,500 frames a second, and this one's 12,500, but also with more dynamic range, which is pretty impressive.
So we'll get into some Onyx shots later on. So yeah, that explains the dynamic range. Do you think, therefore, there's no? Because I remember I did a Nestle shoot recently, and we had like the Alexa for the main unit camera, and then we had a second high-speed unit, and we were shooting like this airport in Dubai, quite big wide shots. And I found that when I set the Phantom Flex up, I had to light differently than I was lighting with the Alexa. And then when we spoke about this previously, you suggested that maybe there is an argument if you are under a kind of restricted budget, there's an argument that if you have a high element of high speed shots and you're trying to integrate them into your kind of main unit shots or your more general shots, there is an argument for shooting everything on the Phantom, and it's just basically having to kind of set up your contrast lighting once rather than having to adjust it with each of the formats. What do you think of that?
I mean, I mean, you've asked me a few things there, but I mean, when there's a need to shoot normal speed and a need to shoot high speed, if I get allowed into the conversation at an early enough stage, I would always advise them to try and use a Flex 4K instead of getting an Alexa Mini and a VO 4K, because ultimately you've got one piece of kit that does it all. Yes, there may be compromises, but ultimately you don't have to match one shot to the other, i.e. grade one camera to the other, light one camera to the other so that they match. And the lacking on the Flex 4K is that it hasn't got 14.5 stops like an Alexa has. It's got 12.5 stops. But for the most part, 12.5 is enough. Obviously, I'm slightly biased, and but the reality is, if you're going to get an Alexa Mini and you're going to get a VO 4K, you're going to be compromised in both areas, and you probably need double the amount of kit. You do just the Flex 4K, that camera will shoot like a normal camera up to 120 at 4K, and it will do the faster speeds beyond, and it won't inhibit you. And the only place it inhibits you is with the latitude. If it's an interior shoot and you control the light, it's probably more than enough dynamic range for you at 12.5 stops. Exterior, it becomes difficult. If you point up at the sky, absolutely. And I would always say it's possible, but I'd always let the DP make his decision on that. Regarding lighting, cameras have different contrast ranges. So if you're trying to put a Phantom in, whether it be a VO or a Flex 4K, in with the same scene as an Alexa, and AB them, shoot one, then shoot the other, ultimately one lighting or camera needs to be dumbed down to the other a little bit. The Flex 4K doesn't have the dynamic range, so you tend to need to add a bit of fill light to cheat that it's got a bit more latitude if you're looking at a high highlight situation. So you tend to protect the highlights and add fill to make it look like it's got a bit more latitude.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Good answer. Jake, is it worth pausing now and seeing if you've got any questions to answer?
There's some in the Discord chat already.
Okay.
Shall I read them, Ian?
Yes, please.
So I asked a quick one from Aaron before. He's saying, how much do you approach lighting when you're shooting at just high shutter speeds? What lighting tool tends to be your go-to when LED aren't powerful enough? Is HMI the way to go? It really depends. That question is, it really depends. There's another question as well. Is it true that 5K or bigger don't flicker as much because they don't cool down? That is true. generally the bigger light in tungsten is the most stable, but I always see a little bit of flicker on tungsten shoots, although you can get away with that most of the time, but always aim for 5K. If you're aiming for light smaller than 5K for a shoot more than 120 frames a second, they'll flicker horribly. Another one, with the current revolution, do we just use a ton of LED sky panels? Again, every job's different. Tungsten, HMI, LED, they all have a place, and it really depends. And of course, you can mix and match all of it.
As we'll get onto later, because we've got a couple of examples of using some later technologies coming up. Any more questions?
I'm just going to read them quick. Are there some large parts still working with 2K? Okay, there's a really good question here from Ryan Crossman. Are some larger post houses still working with 2K workflows? Do you still think it's important to work in 4K for high speed? Also, what would you average in terms of storage for rushes a day? Okay, so 2 questions. Is a 4K workflow imperative? Well, the problem that you've got with that question, it's a really valid question, because pretty much every commercial finishes in HD or 2K at best. The problem that you've got is that people are not developing new cameras that are in HD unless they're extremely specialist like the Onyx. So if you're doing shoots that are up to 1,000 frames a second and you don't want to shoot any more than 2K, you've got 2 choices. You use a Flex 4K and you window the sensor, so you'd use 16mm depth of field and you would ignore the rest of the sensor, or you use an older camera. In my opinion, I would go with a Flex 4K at 2K because it's got better dynamic range. But ultimately, just because you're capturing it in the camera doesn't mean that they can't work in 2K for post. You can downsample it for post. And I wouldn't use an older camera that was developed 10 years ago just because you don't want to shoot, you don't want to work in above 2K. So it's a common question. I suspect Ryan's produced.
Okay, good. Shall we? Is that all the questions now?
All the questions I've seen.
Jake, that's all the questions, is it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool. Okay, shall we have a look at another clip then? What's up next? Is it Sherlock?
Yep.
Yeah, so should we look at Sherlock next?
Mustn't register on an emotional level. First, distract target. Then block his blind jab. Counter with cross to left cheek. Discombobulate. Dazed, he'll attempt wild haymaker. Employ elbow block. And body shot. Block feral left. Weaken right jaw. Now fracture. Break cracked ribs. Traumatize solar plexus. Dislocate jaw entirely. Heel kick to diaphragm. In summary, ears ringing, jaw fractured, 3 ribs cracked, 4 broken, diaphragm hemorrhaging. Physical recovery 6 weeks. Full psychological recovery 6 months. Capacity to spit it back of head neutralized.
So, how is it doing that?
Well, it was an experience. That was my first outing with a high-speed camera on a large feature film, and this is prior to the normal speed digital revolution. Alexas weren't out. Film was still king, and I started that on the second day of principal photography with, yeah, it was an experience.
Were they set up lighting wise? Were they set up to shoot high speed?
No, definitely not. The first day I did on that was at the top of St Paul's, not that scene, a different scene, and the film cameras were using 500 tungsten, and the Phantom HD that I had there was 160 ASA camera. But the difference between the film camera and the digital camera is that was 500 ASA shooting at 24 frames a second, and we were shooting 700, 800 frames a second. So you needed a lot more light, a hell of a lot more light, and the right kind of light. And that was a tough shoot. And obviously, first time working with Guy Ritchie, who doesn't like to wait around. And so yeah, it was an experience.
And so what? Do you remember how they ended up lighting it?
That was all using large tungsten lights, 5K, 10Ks. Although the DP's choice, Philip Rousselot, he uses Chinese lanterns and lots of small lights. So when setting up for the bare knuckle fight scene that we just showed, they were shooting that for 2 or 3 days before the high speed shoot scene, and they had to relight everything to make it look like they'd lit it at 24 frames a second to make it look like 700 frames a second. And I don't think I mean, I get the feeling they didn't want to move on to us. The DP didn't want to move on to our shot.
So that's an example of production really, getting the heads of department together in the pre-production stage and kind of working out the technical requirements before the very expensive.
I'll be honest with you, one of my jobs, or used to be, I don't do it so much anymore because high speed is a lot more common than it was back then. That was 2008 when we shot that. I reached out through production to the DP, but I never got through to him, and I never ever found out if they ever passed the message on. Well, this is a very big budget film, and you've got some relatively young kid with a new job role trying to speak to an Oscar-winning DP when he's booked for a job, when he's in pre-production on a movie that Robert Downey Jr. is in. He probably didn't get the message, and if he did, he probably didn't do anything about it.
Right.
And it was difficult, and it was quite clear he didn't want to use the camera, but he did, and he got some great footage in the end.
Yeah. So Robert Downey Jr. is really hitting that guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, so when you use these sort of cameras, it's very difficult to cheat and have an open hand slap or an open-handed punch, which is probably what they did when they were shooting at normal speed, because the time is so much faster when you hit someone at normal speed at full power, but obviously not connecting. You probably don't see it connect or know it connects. In this particular case, after the first take, I think Guy said that he was going to get upgraded and Robert would have to hit the big guy. And so he did.
And was the big guy kind of stuntman, or was he just an actor that got slapped around for a day's work?
I don't know if you know Snatch, the later film from Guy Ritchie.
Yes,
he was the boxer in that. So
of course,
I don't really know what his background is, but he's obviously a big guy that Guy Ritchie likes to use.
He doesn't mind getting hit occasionally for art. Okay, that's really cool. And did you? I can't remember if you mentioned what speeds they were shot at. The punch, the fighting bare knuckle fighting sequence. What speeds were they?
That was 700 frames a second. They wanted to get to 1,000, but they didn't have enough light. And after the St. Paul's scenario where they got one 5K light out, and I advised them to shoot at a slower speed just for light levels. It wasn't ideal. I think they wanted to shoot at 1,000, but I think they managed to relight the whole set in about 2 hours for high speed. I don't think it was ever part of the schedule.
Right. What's your view on shooting at say 700 and then trying to slow it down further in post-production?
I'm not a post guy, so I can't really tell you categorically. I mean, there are loads of software out there that does things like this, and people do it all the time. And from what I hear, it really depends on what it is that you're doing. I think if you slow stuff down 2 or 3 times, that's fine. But if you're going to take a shot that's shot at 25 or 50 frames and trying to make it 500 or 1,000, you struggle. But and it really depends on what it is. I think it needs to have hard edges. If you do things like water, where it's soft edges, I think that the software doesn't do a great job. I think it's always improving, and that's not
Yeah.
really my area. But yeah, people do it all the time. Although, if you're shooting at 700 and you know you're going to slow it down, then I would always say shoot it slower. But maybe the question is loaded from we didn't shoot it slow enough and it's in post.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a post guy, so I can't really answer that. So I'm not abreast of all the latest slow mo software out there.
And is there any times justification that when you're getting into the kind of 500 upwards frames per second, do you ever narrow the shutter any further to try and get sharper imagery? Is there any for pouring shots, water shots, or explosions, anything like that? Is there any reason to go for even narrower shutter than the frame rate dictates?
Yeah, I mean, when you've got a really fast action, and you're trying to stop blur, you generally max out the frame rate first, because the frame rate will always give you shutter as well. So if it's really
Yeah.
fast, chances are you want to slow it down as much as you can. And if it's
Yeah.
still blurred, right, and it's sharp, you know it's in focus, then it's motion blur. And if it's motion blur, you definitely want to start putting more light in and making the shutter even skinnier.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
obviously energy explosions, glass explosions, things like that, you definitely want to have really hard shutter,
Yeah.
really tight shutter.
Okay. So speaking of explosions, that kind of leads us nicely onto our next sequence, which is a solo, Star Wars solo. Jake, are you there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Should we have a quick look at that solo sequence? Should we look at that again? And this time, Jason, do you want to talk us through it a little bit?
Well, I mean, I'll give you a bit of a rundown first, and then we can play it again in a minute.
Yeah.
So for me, this is quite a moment in my career, because I've always been a Star Wars fan and a Han Solo fan, because I was born in '71, and so to have the opportunity to work on this movie, for me, was amazing. I did some various Flex 4K stuff on location with them, but for me, doing this one shot here that we just showed you, although I couldn't find the real clip from the movie available, and that was a sort of slight VFX breakdown. And that's a shot of um, a rocket fuel called coaxium getting hijacked from a train, and Han Solo screws up and he has to drop it, and it hits a mountain. And the VFX department wanted to shoot this for real instead of VFX, and rebuilding it in 3D. So they came to me, having seen some inspiration from the slow-mo guys, and said, can we do something like that? And so we used a camera called a Phantom V2512, which is still the fastest camera out there, but it only had a resolution of 720p and about 5 or 6 tops of latitude. But it was the fastest, biggest resolution camera available, or in existence. So we set the shot up, and we used two 99 kilowatt long strike lights, which are lights that are a cross between continuous and flash, that are Luminese lights, also from Cirrolite. These are some of my favorite lights, and they stay on for a very short amount of time, between 2 and 10 seconds. This particular shot probably lasted 0.2 of a second at most, at 25,000 frames a second, and it was an underwater explosion that was situated in a 3D model of the mountain, which when we play it back again, you'll be able to see how the mountain fits in. And there's quite a lot of internet breakdown of this. The VFX supervisor basically broke it down in a conference, and that video is available. But it's just, you just get some amazing footage when you shoot underwater at high speed with pyro. And so this one moment, I think we shot for 2 days, and we did something like 150 explosions. And the VFX department always said they weren't sure how they were going to use it. They were either going to up-res it and insert it, use it as reference and copy it in 3D. And in the end, they actually used the footage and up-resed it, which really makes me happy.
Yeah, great. Should we watch it again?
Sure. With you, I can't remember.
Right.
I can't remember, but we used 230,000 watts of light on that.
Christ.
That was an explosion that didn't get any bigger than 12 inches across when it was the full ball of it.
Yeah.
We used a 50mm lens, and I think we shot at T22 and a 60-degree shutter.
Right. Very interesting. Now, you just reminded me of something, actually. I intended that when we started this whole talk today, I intended to ask you straight off the bat a little bit about what brought you into this industry and how you ended up in high speed. And you just reminded me of that by telling me about Star Wars being one of your childhood kind of, ambitions would be to kind of have some contribution to that. So would you mind talking a little bit about how you kind of got into the industry and how you ended up here?
I started at a very small studio in Marylebone. In actual fact, I always wanted to get into the music business. And when I was 20, I came back from traveling in Thailand and India, and I got myself a job delivering cars. And I delivered a car to a studio in Marylebone, and I asked the guy who was taking delivery of the car for a job, and I hustled him for about a year, and eventually he caved in and gave me a job. And it wasn't in the recording studio; it was in their film studio, which is a very small little hole of a place in Marylebone. And it did corporate talking heads and porn, and it was kind of either one of those or the other. And I quite enjoyed there, and I realized I didn't really want to get into the recording business, and actually in the music business. I didn't want to be in the studio. I actually like to be on location. So I actually went through all the call sheets in that place after I worked there for a couple of years and knocked on every single cameraman door because I thought, what's the quickest way of, what's the next step but getting on location? And I can see one of them's here. He asking me a question, which I will not repeat here. Steve Court, you know who you are.
Yeah, you can show me the question later. Is there any more questions? Maybe less X-rated than that one.
There is another question. So there's someone asking me about flying drones on quads and high speed. So we've done lots of tracking vehicle work with on quad bikes, electric tracking vehicles, remote tracking vehicles, you name it. Drones, we've done drones ourselves to test, but I've never had one person who would actually want to put the camera on a drone and do it for real. And the reason is generally when you're wide, which is why you stick a camera on a drone, generally, the wider you are, the less speed you need. And for the most part, 200 frames a second, an Alexa Mini does most of the drone work because you don't tend to need really high frame rate on drones. I know people have done it and they've done it for a sort of PR stunt, and occasionally someone does it for a job. But I find the real request where people really want to do it, they don't do it. And it's just quite simply, I mean, if you're doing counter moves, high action shots, absolutely, and I'd love to do it. But most people don't do it. They don't need the speed.
Right. It's interesting you say the wider the shot, the less speed you tend to need. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Generally, it's the way. You tend to do a wide shot at 200 or 300 frames a second with probably only needing 100. And the closer you go, the more the speed builds.
So speaking of sort of the origins of you getting into the industry, persistence clearly pays off in this regard. And I noticed that a lot of people in the industry don't. It's more of a conscious choice these days to get into the industry. But a lot of the people I've worked with over the years have ended up in the industry by chance more than anything else. So yeah, there's something to be said for kind of seeing where life takes you. But obviously, if you want to kind of get into the industry, then clearly persistence helps.
Oh, absolutely, definitely.
And having a sense of what you want out of it also will help guide you through it, right? Were you always kind of interested in high speed when you got into the industry? How did you kind of first come about sort of knowing that that's a specialism that you wanted to kind of pursue?
Well, I sort of fell into it, to be honest with you. I got myself out there as a camera assistant, and when I started in the early 90s, Beta SP was slowly being phased out, digital beta cam, but 16mm and 35mm for commercials was the only thing. But because I did documentary work and starting to get into commercial work and drama work, I learnt film and video at the same time. Video turned into digital, digibetas, and then that turned into HD cams, Sony 900s and things like that. And at the same time, I was still loading and doing film work. But I started to get a name for myself as someone who knew digital cameras while for test commercials, which you don't seem to hear that phrase anymore, but there were a lot more test commercials, kind of, proof of concepts. And ultimately, people didn't use film for them. But they'd book a reputable cameraman. Their reputable cameraman assistants didn't know digital cameras. So this is before DITs were out. I mean, the phrase didn't even exist. So I was a camera assistant, a focus puller who knew digital cameras. And the Sonys, they had a lot of control, and you could create a lot of looks, and a lot of people didn't know that. And I was quite good at showing people how to do that. And I just got a name for myself, someone who knew digital as well as film, but more with the weight in digital ultimately. And I got offered a job to run a bigger independent rental house's high-speed camera before it was HD, and I took the job because it was different. And that's where I started to really love high speed and started to explore phantoms. And, it was a kind of new world. I remember getting a phantom delivered at this rental house, and someone phoned me and said, "I've heard you've got a phantom delivered. I need you." And I'm like, I don't know how it works yet. And they're like, "I'll phone you back." 20 minutes later, he says, "Do you know how it works yet?" The Phantoms were a craze in 2007, 2008, where we first started messing around with these things. And it was an amazing place to be. People had not seen this sort of imagery on set before. I mean, photosonics existed, people shooting high speed, but the key is you couldn't play it back in HD on set the second you press cut.
Yeah.
And there's something about that gratification that, for those first few years, the looks on people's faces was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to getting into a new technology early on, and there's certainly benefits, money to be made and careers to be established if you get that right technology at the right time. If you invested in an Alexa when it first came out, you would have done very, very well out of it. And yeah, I remember that period you're talking about. In fact, the reason I got into cinematography myself actually was through a kind of love for high speed, and I actually managed to talk a camera engineer who helped facilitate arsenal cameras for the natural history cameramen that used to usually own their own cameras, and he had an old Action Master 16mm photosonics camera. And my showreel, and the reason I got into what helped me become a DOP was I bolted that to my bathroom wall and basically got a model and sort of semi-drowned her in my bath, and that became my showreel. So I've got a lot to thank for high speed, and that's why I was particularly excited about talking to you about high speed today, because it's been one of those things that kind of gave me the sort of kind of artistic impulse originally to get into cinematography, and certainly provided some beautiful images to help me along with my first showreel. Yeah, and the way it's progressed now, with, like you said, with that digital feedback to be able to see exactly what's happening. I remember the early days of shooting photosonics when we were shooting it on commercials, and you'd have to wait for the cameras to come up to speed, so you had the sound of a drill coming up to speed, and then it would be action cut, and you wouldn't know whether you got it or not,
Yeah.
And I shot very early on. I shot a Nikon commercial, and we went to South Africa to shoot, and we all shot a lot of it high speed, a lot of it on a photosonics, and one of the shots flickered, and I never forget the phone call I got from the producer telling me this, and I was absolutely mortified. It was one of the hardest weeks of my career. It ended up actually working out quite well, because the flicker actually helped the feeling of the shot, and we got away with it. But I remember how that felt. So yeah.
What lights were you using?
We were using HMI lights, but I think one of the ballast didn't get flicked to flicker free. We're using big HMIs. I remember it's exterior in Cape Town. Yeah, and one of the lights, the ballast wasn't on silent. Sorry, it wasn't on high speed. It was on silent.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the problem occurred. But yeah, I remember that. That's back in the film days. If you made a mistake, you really paid for it. It was nowhere, as a DOP, there's nowhere to hide. It's like you had to sort of put your hands up and go, right, yeah, okay, I fucked up. But yeah. So we got a couple more clips to show, and these clips actually are something we shot together, right? This is a brand. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this brand, but it's a sportswear brand called Gymshark. And what's unique about Gymshark is they basically one of the few emerging, kind of growing companies that pretty much do all of their marketing on social media. So we were shooting a boxer, Roxanne, who used to be a world champion kickboxer and was moving into traditional boxing because there's more money to be made in that sport, and we basically suggested that Gymshark use her as an influencer. They're very into personal stories and the reasons people get into exercise. So the idea that there's this young Muslim girl who basically went against her family and her community and became a professional fighter. They like that story, that kind of grit and determination that sort of character exhibits to be able to achieve something like that. So we shot this short film for Gymshark, and we managed to talk Jason into helping us out with the high speed. And he had a new camera at the time called the Onyx, which we've referred to earlier on in this talk. And the Onyx camera was unique because it's the first kind of camera that shoots at is it 12,000 frames a second?
Yeah, so it smashed the HD speed record by over 4 times. So 25 to 2,800 frames a second was the fastest you could go at HD before the Onyx came out, and this one does 12,500. And we're the only people to have it in Europe and the Middle East, and Able Cinetech have it in the States. And it's a real niche camera, but it's a great fun toy.
Yeah. So we had that camera. We managed to get a bolt arm as well for one of the day shooting. But the first sequence we're going to look at is there's actually two sequences we're going to look at. We should maybe look at them back to back because they're part of a series. This is the kind of Instagram shortcut series that we're going to release on Instagram. So Jake, could you cue that up? Okay, so you could see there was two high-speed, there's a whole high-speed sequence of Roxana sort of falling unconscious through the sort of the floor of the ring, and that we got some behind the scenes of that as well. So Jake, I think you got that queued up as well. Have you not? So let's talk about the lighting first, shall we? So we were using was it, I can't remember now, is it Lumini's long strikes we're using for that?
Yeah, the 99Ks as well, like the Solo.
Yeah. So how much light in total do we have on that set?
I think we used 4 99Ks for that.
Right. And we're shooting at around, what's it, around 10,000 frames a second?
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty sure it was 10,000.
One of the surprises I had when I saw that footage back for the first time, I was really excited by actually, we had a tarpaulin over the crash mats, and Roxana was diving, as you can see, diving into the crash mats. And there's like something happens at ultra high speed framing where you see events, because you're seeing an event so slowly, you're seeing details of that event that you would not normally have noticed. And the thing that really excited me about it when I watched it back was you'd see these kind of beads of water that were on the actual surface of the mat. And when Roxana hit the mat, you'd have this kind of ricochet of the beads kind of coming up towards her. So when she actually hit the the surface of the mat, it actually felt like, to me, it felt like she's like falling through the mat, and the water was coming up along with the rain effect coming down. So you had this kind of really beautiful sort of transition from with the kind of counter movement of the water, and I really liked that. And I didn't notice that when we were shooting it. I only noticed that after we shot it. And I felt that was a real kind of little gift we got. And the other high-speed shot we did on that shoot was Roxana getting punched, which again we shot that on a bolt, didn't we? We don't have any BTS of that, unfortunately, but that was an example of trying to get a high-speed shot on a bolt camera move, which I found quite tricky because obviously the timings of it all, and to get, like we witnessed earlier with Robert Downey Jr., to get the punch to feel real at that frame rate is another tricky thing. So I learned quite a lot that day, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, timings and choreography is definitely a highly important thing. 1,000 frames a second, you 1 second of shooting is 40 seconds slower. So when you're, trying to call 3, 2, 1 and a specific action at normal speed, it's pretty easy. You say action, the actor hears it, they do the action. But when you're shooting at 1,000 frames a second, obviously the delay between action and the actor hearing it and then acting and doing that move, there's a delay, and the camera really shows that. Then you do it at 10,000 frames a second, and 10,000 frames a second is 1 second plays out for 12 and a half. 1 second plays out for 500 seconds, which is 8.5 minutes.
See, that's the other danger of ultra high speed framing, particularly in commercials, is you get to, like each kind of event that you're filming has a kind of natural sort of maximum frame rate that kind of looks interesting, right? So one of the conversations I was having with the director when we were shooting a Gymshark was that if we don't have water droplets falling through frame quite quickly, then you just end up with someone falling through shot really slowly that can actually look quite boring, So you need kind of particle movements when you get over a certain frame rate. I think you need to have some kind of movement of particles in the frame to justify that speed. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, you have to work hard to try and make slow-mo not be boring, because ultimately, once you see the beginnings of a shot, if it's someone like falling through a large piece of air, your brain is already knowing what happens on the frame ahead of you. So you really need to have a much faster action, some high impact. Yeah, I mean, you need to have special effects as well. It really depends on what you're after and how long you want the shot to last for. I suppose the Gymshark piece is a little bit gratuitous to a certain extent, so you have the ability to show a lot more than you would do on a normal ad. But most ads are 30 seconds long, and so if you're going to do some slow mo, you've got to have you've got to have some really interesting shots if you're going to let them play out for a length of time, or you've got to have quite a few fast cutting ones.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Do we have, Jake? Do we have any more questions on coming in at all?
There are
There's a couple in the Discord chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just read one here. So I'm going to go back to Ryan. He asked me, "What's your average term of storage rushes over a day?" Flex 4K, I always say allow for 4 terabytes a day, but you can often shoot a lot more than that, and you can often shoot a lot less. That's kind of what I say, 4 terabytes. What changes would you ask Vision Research to build next generation Phantom camera? More resolution, more dynamic range. If the director DP wants to pair high speed with Moco Bolt, would you suggest working with a team that knows how to do both, or separate teams that work together? Well, we can supply bolts, but we always use the specialist Moco operators to go with them. I believe you need to have separate people for this. One is a camera specialist, one is an audio specialist. And that's how I do it. There's no hard and fast rules, but together you're going to have a long day with Moco and high speed. So it's always best to get the best people. And then someone's asking me about remote control systems. We have some bespoke things. We use ubiquities to control cameras and various remote systems. I think this one's for you, Ian. Where do you find work as a DP?
Yeah, that's the most commonly asked question I get asked, and I wish I knew the answer to that. Yeah.
Just doing good work and letting the work come to you, I assume, is the best way.
Yeah, I mean, you're constantly fighting to stay relevant, fighting to do more creative work. You're fighting to kind of get into areas of cinematography that specialist areas that you might not have demonstrated an ability, but that's something you're interested in. For example, if you want to shoot a car, it's hard to get a car commercial unless you shot cars. So my advice is work out what it is you actually want to do. If there's a specialist sort of area that you're interested in, and then find a way to demonstrate that, because you'll only get the work that you can demonstrate that you can do. So one of my some of the work I'm doing now, I do a lot of work that's low budget because I think it's going to progress my reel in a certain direction. And certainly nowadays, sort of doing the cooler work, the work that I get paid the most money for is a huge amount of money in food photography, for example, because there's always, particularly now in coronavirus, there's going to be a lot more food commercials. There's always been, in the 90s, it was kind of lots of beauty campaigns. If you watch daytime TV in the 90s, you had inundated with beauty campaigns, and nowadays it seems to be food. So having a specialism in something can be a good thing, because you'll get known for that and you'll make money out of that. But yeah, working out what it is the kind of work you want to do, and then somehow finding a way to demonstrate that is probably the best advice. Getting people to employ you, I mean, that's a mysterious one. I mean, it's social media is helping a lot more now. Having an agent clearly helps. Being sociable, being able to talk to people helps a great deal. Knowing what to say to producers, to directors, to agency on a film set, that will help you get re-employed. There's many skills to kind of staying employable these days, and there's a huge amount of competition. So whereas before there's maybe I was one of maybe 40 people doing high-end work in London, now I'm probably one of 7,000. So it's not weighted in our favor. So we're very expendable, and you upset a production manager or you upset a director, chances are you won't work at that company again. So yeah, if you've got a magic trick to getting more work, please let me know. Yeah, any more questions?
There's another one. I'm pretty sure this one's for you. What techniques do you find work for controlling softness of light, given you need to get the maximum punch out of your fixtures, presumably by bringing them closer to the subject, keeping the look cohesive with non-high-speed footage?
Well, it's the quantity of light, really. If you're going to be softening your light down, you just need more of it to begin with. I mean, the long strikes we're using, those Luminis lights, have got a long kind of narrow bulb, kind of, they're quite broad looking lights. So once you put them through a diffusion, you end up with very even soft light. So they're quite good for that. Obviously there's more specular lights, like, the Fresnel, the big Fresnel lights. You need probably to bank those in groups and then put them through diffusion again to kind of soften them down. It's usually, I mean, would you agree, Jason? It's just starting off with enough light to begin with, and then being able to shape it from there.
I mean, the world that we're in, always bigger light is always best. You can always do something with it. You can put it on the lens, you can put it on the shutter, you can put an ND in it, you can add extra softening. So big lights are always an attraction because it gives you more options. Even if you don't need them, you've got them if you need them. I mean, I'm not saying book a
Yes.
big light when you don't need it, but what I'm saying is it's always good to have a big one.
Yeah, I mean, my rule of thumb when I was shooting film was I'd always like to 2 stops more than I needed, because you never know when a focus puller is going to ask you for another stop, and you never know when a director's going, can we shoot this at 50 frames, you know? So I always used to light with 2 stops kind of in my pocket, you know, just in case I need it. And with high speed, I think that's even more crucial. So one of the themes that I believe has come out of today's talk is the fact that when you're preparing for high speed, then you really got to start by assuming that you're going to need a lot more light than you first think you need. Because firstly, you need to get to those frame rates. You need to be able to shape the light the way you want to shape it. Now, remember, you've got a slightly less dynamic range on some of the cameras, so you might need more fill light, you know. And then when you get to that shape of light and that look of light you're after, then you've got to factor in the fact that if you're shooting a quick event like an explosion or something that requires maybe more depth of field, as Jason pointed out earlier, to be able to read it properly. You know, if you're shooting macro stuff, then certainly you're going to need more depth of field. So all in all, you guys, you know, we're all used to shooting on very sensitive, you know, very highly sensitive cameras with, you know, very sharp lenses wide open, and we're used to shooting this kind of cinematic look at, you know, 1.4, very selective focus look that has become very popular nowadays. When you jump from that to like high speed, then you're really going back into the realms of lots of light, deep focus. You know, it's like going back to the origins of cinematography, where people, you know, shooting deep focus on slow black and white film stocks, you know, and for that you need big lights. Back then they used carbon arcs, you know, very powerful, specular, beautiful lights actually. And nowadays, as Jason points out, you need big lights. So whether that be tungsten, HMI, or you know, the LED, or the what are the the Luminis? What's the gas in them? Do you know? Is it a special kind of
I think it's xenon.
Xenon, right? Yeah, that makes
I
sense.
mean, I would say those lights, we've mentioned them a few times, but I would just want to mention one thing about those lights. And as much as we use them on Gymshark, as a general rule, you don't tend to use them with subjects that are alive, because are human or an animal, because they go from modeling to full brightness in seconds, and your eyes need to adjust. So as a general rule, you don't tend to use those for anything other than a really high impact explosion or something inanimate. Um, and I just wanted to mention that, because then they are hard to use with humans, and especially in that particular way we used it, where we're shooting at night and you've got someone falling down, and a second before it falls down, the whole of her eyes gets whited out by almost 400 kilowatts of light. We had to be really careful with her, but you know, and to a certain extent, there isn't anything else to use. Well, you could use soft suns, but although they don't work at that speed, you had to use them, but they're generally not used for humans.
Yeah, and luckily we had a tough boxer who we put through all kinds of punishment on that
Yeah,
shoot.
yeah,
But you're quite right. If we had someone maybe with blue eyes and had very sensitive, you know, blue eyes are usually more sensitive to light than dark eyed. Yeah, we could have had problems. I mean, I've had problems with beauty commercials before where I've put too much light on someone's face to try and get their hair to shine, and they start squinting, you know. So yeah, I've run into that before quite often. So you're quite right. Yeah, it's interesting. The eyes have got to get adjust to the level of light for someone to look, you know, yeah, look normal. Yeah. Are there any more questions, Jake?
So you asked about wireless control already. Will 10 to 20 million FPS but short burst be useful in cinematography? We use it in scientific research a lot.
Wow, what's that one again?
Would how many million frames a second?
10 to 20 million.
Who's that from? Just out of interest.
It's a Nuo Zoo.
I very much doubt it. I think that we're probably at the upper end with the Onyx of frame rates required for cinematography. I'm sure there's the odd person who wants more, and occasionally pyro and bullet shots get requested, and you need many more frames per second than the Onyx can do. But things like that for cinematography, for advertising, for movies, very rare. One millions of frames a second is going to be too slow. And that's my opinion.
Yeah.
1 second at 12.5 plays out for 8.5 minutes. 1 second at 12,500 frames a second plays out for 8.5 minutes. I don't know what the maths is in millions of frames a second, but it's going to be a long time.
And we'll do one last question to wrap it up. So Furkan asks in YouTube, tips for shooting at 120 frames a second.
What, from me or from Jason?
I don't know.
I think it's you, Ian. 120.
I knew you were going to pass that one over to me. Well, just light it properly. That would be my first tip, regardless of what speed you're shooting at. And like we said earlier, have enough stop in your pocket just in case you need to stop down for whatever reason, or you need to shape the light more, and just start with a big enough light to kind of get that speed with ease. Because you might discover that it doesn't look quite right at 1.4. You might need to stop down on it. That would be my advice. And watch out for flicker, obviously. We discussed that earlier, but with tungsten lights, they need to be over a certain size. With HMI lights, they need to be high-speed ballast. So when you're putting your camera lists in, make sure you order high-speed ballast for certain lights, or just double-check with your gaffer that your HMIs have got a high-speed ballast. 100, is it 1,000 hertz ballasts?
1,000 hertz, yeah. 1,000 hertz.
Yeah. LEDs, again, check that they're going to be you're not going to have flicker problems at 120 frames. And that's it, I think. Is there any more questions coming in?
No, I think we should wrap up there. Yeah, we've been live for just over an hour and a half now, so I think we should wrap it up there.
So I was just going to do a quick summary. I mean, one last question I'd like to ask Jason, just because of the coronavirus situation, is there any comments you want to make, or any kind of predictions you have on how it might change your world, high-speed shooting?
Very difficult to say, really. I mean, there are various documents being produced about people shooting under the current situations or soon. I personally think it's too early to start really working that out, although I understand why people are. And I think people just need to take their own decisions and work out as much as possible whatever shoot they're being asked to do, if they're going to feel comfortable with the plan, and make sure that the plan is the way it's sold to you. It's really hard, I mean, for everybody. I don't think, I think everybody just wants to shoot on their own or with one other person. That's the only thing I hear. But the feasibility of anything other than the most basic shoots becomes very difficult when you're limited to one or two people. I think we all want this over with. But nobody really sees how we get out of it, or what's our first steps, to anything going back to the old days. The old days, as in the beginning of March.
Yeah, the old days being the beginning of March, indeed. Yeah, that'll be a new normal after this, no doubt. Look, Jason, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'd like to just sum up what we've been speaking about a little bit before we wrap it up. And, if anyone's got further questions, then please contact, you can contact either me on my Instagram, Ian Murray DOP, and I'll be doing, what I'm hoping to do is do a cut down of some of this stuff, and maybe add some additional footage for a YouTube video that we'll be releasing on the Ian Murray DOP YouTube channel. Just to sum up, we've basically gone through all the lights and the problems obviously with flicker. There is a perception thing, actually, I wouldn't mind mentioning with that as well. Jason, you said to me, I remember when I asked you before the Nestle shoot, what about the flickering? I actually called Jason up, and the director shot something on an iPhone at 120 frames and said to me, no, 200 frames or something, and he said to me, I've been in the location, I shot at 200 frames at this airport in Dubai. Does that mean we can shoot high speed? And you know, the answer to that was no, right? Because of you don't know how iPhone have got to that speed, and when you shoot on a proper high speed camera, then you have to factor in the flicker problem that we spoke about earlier. And you were giving me that information when we were talking about this. You were giving me advice about the perception of flicker, and you were saying with a hard backlight, for example, that might show a perceivable flicker more likely than when you bank soft lights together and diffuse them. You know, so it's about perception as well. It's what, you know, you could argue that there's always some form of flicker, but it's whether it's perceived or not is the issue. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, let me deal with the iPhone. I don't really know if iPhones shoot a high frame rate or they just interpolate. So, and I don't know if anyone really does know that. I mean, so if you shoot in a scenario where the light should be flickering and it's not, it's highly likely that the iPhone is interpolating, i.e., it's creating the frames in between to make it look like it's slow-mo. I don't know. So I don't really know if you can use an iPhone or a small digital camera, you know, a cheap digital camera that does high frame rate to basically do a recce to see if the light in this location will not flicker or not. So for me, I can't say that. Regarding flicker in general, I think there's flicker on every shoot to a certain extent. There are only a few lights that are pure DC with long strikes are probably the only ones that you'll never see flicker. But things like tungsten, you get mains ripple that always happens, even if you use large tungsten heads. And sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. HMIs, ballast, header cable, bulb, every single one of them needs to be working perfectly for no flicker. And again, they have mains ripple. So essentially 1 to 3% flicker is always visible. But if you use lots of lights, the chances are you're going to eradicate your flicker. Whereas if you use one hard backlight and it's flickering, you're going to see it. If you then add smoke, you'll see it even more. So you kind of have to use multiple heads to kind of eradicate it. But for me, I can't stop the shoot if it's flicker. I have to tell people I see it, but I don't want them to stop it. I want them to play around with it and minimize it as much as they can and then get on and shoot, because ultimately you've got what you've got to do the job. And unless it's awful and it's, you know, really malfunctioning, I'd just get on with it. And the minute you do your action shot, nobody's going to be looking at the back wall that's got a little bit of flicker when you've got a beautiful pouring shot in the background. I mean, but that's my opinion. So, you know, as a job on set, I have to point it out. But at the same time, I want the resolution to be quick and easy. I don't want to give people problems. I also want them to go, oh, it's nothing. We'll get on and shoot it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes you could argue that, you know, there's a perception now that high speed has flicker. If you look at sports coverage, a lot of the high speed shots have flicker anyway. So some people actually like that effect, you know, and they use that effect to sort of, you know, as part of the kind of high speed language. So, you know, there's always
with sports, because people shoot in stadiums, and with sports, almost flicker is almost a style sometimes with some sporting shoots.
Great. Well, look, so yeah, I guess we sum it up here. I'm hoping that everyone's had their kind of curiosity answered. We've gone into the lighting, we've gone into the cameras, we kind of touched on lenses, but we didn't really talk about specialist lenses, but perhaps that could be another talk at another time, because you know that's a whole conversation in itself. And workflow and the importance of basically prepping, having conversations with specialists like Jason, and understanding really what you're getting into when you embark on high-speed shooting. Thank you, Jason, for all the wonderful wisdom you shared with us today. Yeah, I'm sure people got a lot from it. Yeah, thank you, Jake.
No worries.
And Jason, Love High Speed, based in Wembley. He's got a studio space there as well, and lots of wonderful cameras and lenses to play with. So yeah, if anyone needs their high speed needs met, then that's where to go. And yeah, we'll be doing another talk in a week's time. I'll be speaking to Kerry from Cook Lenses, and we'll be talking about all things glass. So yeah, thank you guys, and thank you for for listening, and thank you, Jason, for being a wonderful guest.